March 1922. A small farmstead in rural Bavaria, known to the few people who knew it at all as Hinterkaifeck. 6 people live there, an older couple, their grown daughter, her 2 young children, and a maid who arrived only hours before. Within a single evening, all 6 are dead. But the killer does not leave. For days afterward, smoke rises from the chimney. The animals are fed. Someone eats meals in the kitchen. Someone, for the better part of a week, lives in that house with the people they have killed. Hinterkaifeck was not a village. It was not even a hamlet. It was a single farmstead standing on its own in the farmland of Upper Bavaria, in southern Germany, roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. The nearest real settlement was a short distance away, but the farm itself stood apart, set off on its own ground, backed by woodland, reached by a track rather than a road. 6 people lived there in March of 1922, and their names matter, because every cold case begins with names. Andreas Gruber was the head of the household. He was in his early 60s. He had a reputation among those who knew him as a hard and difficult man. Katzelia Gruber, his wife, was in her 70s. Victoria Gabriel was their grown daughter, in her mid-30s. She was a widow. She lived on the farm with her parents. Victoria had 2 children. Katzelia Gabriel was 7 years old, and Joseph was 2. That was the household. 5 people, 3 generations, living together on an isolated Bavarian farm. And then, on the very day the killings are believed to have begun, a 6th person arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was the new maid. The previous maid, by some accounts, had left the farm earlier, reportedly because she had become convinced that the place was haunted. Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon she was killed. She had been on the farm for a matter of hours. She never saw the place in daylight as a living household. What makes Hinterkaifeck so disturbing is that the danger announced itself first. In the days before the killings, Andreas Gruber told people in the area about a series of strange events at the farm. He said that he had found footprints in the snow, a single set of tracks leading from the edge of the woods toward the farmhouse, and no tracks leading back. He said that he had heard footsteps in the attic of the house, that a set of house keys had gone missing, that a newspaper had appeared on the property that no one in the household could account for. And there was the scratching. Sounds, by his account, in the structure of the house itself, in the night, from the attic, from somewhere above the family's heads. Today, reading those reports, it is hard not to draw one conclusion. Someone was already there. Someone had, very possibly, been living in the attic of Hinterkaifeck for some time before the killings, coming and going, taking keys, moving in the dark above a sleeping family. But here is the part that has unsettled people for a century. Andreas Gruber told others about all of it: the tracks, the footsteps, the missing keys. And he did not leave. He did not move the family off the farm. He did not, by the surviving accounts, bring in help to search the house from top to bottom. He stayed. The family stayed. And on a day in late March of 1922, whoever had been in the attic came down. The killings at Hinterkaifeck are believed to have taken place over the course of a single evening, most likely on Friday, March 31st, 1922. The reconstruction that investigators later assembled is, by the standards of most cases, unusually specific about the method, and unusually empty about the person. The 4 members of the household who were in or near the barn, Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazelia, his daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old child Kazelia, appear to have been killed in the barn, one after another. The leading interpretation is that they were lured or drawn out to the barn individually or in small groups, and that each was attacked there as they came. The weapon was a heavy-bladed tool, consistent, investigators believed, with a kind of mattock or pickaxe used in farm work. Inside the house, 2 more people were killed. The 2-year-old, Joseph, in his cot, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her room, the woman who had arrived on the farm only hours earlier. 6 people, 3 generations of one family, plus a servant, who was almost a stranger to them. All dead in one evening, on one isolated farm. And then, the part of the Hinterkaifeck case that has no real parallel. The killer stayed. For several days after the killings, there were clear signs of life on the farm. Smoke rose from the chimney. The cattle were fed and tended. A dog on the property was alive and looked after. Food in the kitchen had been eaten. Meals prepared and consumed after the household was dead. Neighbours in the days that followed noticed small things. Mail and a newspaper were collected, or not collected, in ways that seemed slightly wrong. But no one, for several days, went up the track to check. Somewhere in that house, for the better part of a week, a living person moved through rooms that held 6 bodies and tended the farm as if nothing had happened at all. The household was discovered on Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, roughly 4 days after the killings are believed to have happened. By that point, the absence of the Hinterkaifeck family had begun to register in the surrounding community. The 7-year-old Kazelia had not been at school. The family had not appeared at church on Sunday. A repairman who had business at the farm could not get anyone to answer. Eventually, a small group of neighbours went to the farm together to find out what was wrong. They found the 4 members of the household in the barn. They found the 2-year-old and the maid inside the house. And so the investigation began, 4 days late, at a scene that had not been a crime scene, sealed and protected. It had been, for the better part of a week, a place where an unknown person had been living. What followed was, for its time, a serious effort. Investigators came from Munich. The bodies were examined. The scene was studied. Witnesses were interviewed across the surrounding area. But the early 1922 investigation was working against itself from the first hour. The scene had been compromised by days of the killer's presence, and then by the neighbours who found it. Forensic science of 1922 was extremely limited, and there is a detail that has shocked people ever since. By some accounts, the heads of several of the victims were, at one stage of the investigation, separated and sent away for examination, including, reportedly, examination involving clairvoyance. Those remains were, by the accounts that have come down, not all returned, and not all preserved, with the disruptions of the years that followed in Germany making the loss effectively permanent. Which means that even the physical evidence of Hinterkaifeck, the 6 victims themselves, did not survive intact for any later, better equipped investigator to study. Over the past century, the Hinterkaifeck case has been examined again and again. Investigators have returned to it. Students of criminal investigation have used it as a teaching case, and several theories have formed. One theory centres on robbery, but it has always fit poorly. Money was, by some accounts, still found on the farm afterward. A killer who stays for days tending cattle is not behaving like a thief. A second theory looks inside the family's own history. The Hinterkaifeck household was, by the accounts of the time, a troubled one. There were dark rumours about relationships within the family, about the parentage of the children, about old tensions. Some theories propose that the motive lay in those private matters, that the killer was someone with a personal connection to the people on that farm. A third theory returns to the warnings, the footsteps in the attic, the missing keys, the single line of tracks with no return. In this reading, the killer was an outsider who had been secretly living on the property for days, perhaps longer, before the night of the killings. But every theory of Hinterkaifeck runs into the same hard fact. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. Various individuals were suspected across the decades. None of it ever reached proof. The case has the disturbing quality of being almost solvable. The method is known. The killer's behaviour afterward is documented. The warnings beforehand are recorded. Everything about Hinterkaifeck is known, except the one thing a case exists to find: the person who came down from the attic. There is one more reason the Hinterkaifeck case has been so resistant to any modern re-examination. The farm itself is gone. In the period after the killings, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished. The buildings were taken down. The site where 6 people died was, in effect, cleared from the landscape. Today, there is no house. There is no barn. There is no attic with a low hatch for a modern investigator to search. And so the case sits, now, in an almost complete absence. The witnesses are long dead. The original investigators are long dead. Critical physical remains were lost decades ago, and the scene itself, the building, the ground, the structure of the place, has been removed. Hinterkaifeck, as a physical location, no longer exists in any form that could be examined. What survives is the record, the reconstruction, the reports of the warnings, the descriptions of the days the killer stayed. The case file, in other words, and not much else. It is one of the very few major murder cases where the crime scene itself has been so completely undone that there is, in a literal sense, nowhere left to look. The story of Hinterkaifeck has outlived the farm of Hinterkaifeck by a full century. 6 people lived on the Hinterkaifeck farm. None of them survived the night of March 31st, 1922. Andreas Gruber in his 60s, Katzelia Gruber in her 70s, Victoria Gabriel in her 30s, the 7-year-old Katzelia, the 2-year-old Josef, and Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had been on the farm for a few hours. There were no direct survivors of the household to carry the case forward. What carried it was the surrounding community, the neighbours, the investigators, and then, for 100 years, the public. Because Hinterkaifeck did not fade. In Germany, it became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the country's history. It has been studied by generations of investigators. As recently as the modern era, police academies have reportedly used the Hinterkaifeck file as a training exercise, asking students to apply current methods to a century-old case, knowing that no arrest will ever follow. The detail that holds people is always the same one. It is not only that 6 people were killed, it is the days afterward, the smoke from the chimney, the fed cattle, the eaten meals, the sense of someone calmly inhabiting a house of the dead. Whoever that person was, they walked away from Hinterkaifeck when they chose to, and stepped completely out of every record that the world keeps. 100 years later, they have a method, a timeline, and a set of eerie warnings attached to them. They have never had a name. More than a century after the Hinterkaifeck killings, the case remains officially unsolved. It is in many ways a complete case, missing only its centre. We have the warnings. We have the method. We have the reconstruction of the evening. We have the documented, almost unbelievable fact of the days the killer remained. What we do not have, what no investigator in 100 years has produced, is the identity of the person at the heart of it. And the obstacles now are total. The witnesses are gone. The investigators are gone. Key physical evidence was lost long ago. The farm itself has been demolished and erased. What endures is the shape of it. A single farmstead, alone in the Bavarian countryside. Footprints leading in, and none leading out. Footsteps in the attic. 6 people dead in one evening. And a chimney that went on smoking for days. We may never know who lived in that attic. We may never know why they stayed in that house with what they had done. But we know they were there. We know they fed the cattle. We know they ate at that table. And then, when they decided to, they were simply gone. And that, for as long as cold cases are remembered, is what keeps the file open, even when the house is gone. Chalkline file doesn't promise you answers. Sometimes the file is open for 100 years. Sometimes the killer is the one detail the file never holds. 6 people lived on a small farm in Bavaria in the spring of 1922. An older couple, their grown daughter, her 2 small children, and a maid. In a single evening, all 6 were dead. What we have, more than a century later, is a set of warnings no one acted on, a reconstruction of one terrible night, a chimney that smoked for days, and a farm that no longer exists. If you know something the file does not, a name, a recollection, a story carried in a family, from someone who lived near Hinterkaifeck in 1922, every detail still matters. Even now. Even 100 years on. Cold cases stay cold until they don't. This was the Hinterkaifeck file.